mother and father only want, and Christine has said it multiple times, she only wants what you would want. If this was your son, if this was your daughter, wouldn't you want desperately to get to the truth? Wouldn't you want people who were closest in proximity to what happened to be investigated and thoroughly investigated? We know that, you know, if it was Nolan, how would he be investigated?
They son done got killed and they pushing racism. This is the thing that bothers me. Like, we don't know what happened. They don't know what happened. They're doing an investigation. There was black kids there with him too. Why y'all act like y'all not even talking about the black kids, just the white ones?
I'm here with a Nolan Xavier Wells update, and official We Are Humans 2, an excellent creator, posted a video that he found that he said wasn't getting a lot of attention, and he believes it to be another video of Nolan on the boat. Now, here is the still from the boat that you can see, and here is some of the video. I put this into ChatGPT because internet and all you internet sleuth do your thing. We can see the second word daddy on the boat. Now, I had ChatGPT sharpen this up for me, and this looks to be Nolan on this boat. It looks like his blue shorts. You can see his blue shorts here, and then look at the original boat picture. They look to be the same shorts that are in this picture from this newly found video as are in the original boat pictures. What do you guys think about this?
Picture the room for a second before we get into what was actually said inside it. A conference table. A district attorney who holds, in a very literal sense, the power to decide whether anyone is ever formally accused of anything in connection with a teenager's death. Across from her, a mother and father who have not had a single uninterrupted night of sleep since the 4th of July, flanked by a legal team assembled specifically because they stopped trusting the process to move forward on its own. That's the room this update actually came out of. And it's worth holding that image in your mind, because everything else in this video, the grand jury, the phone, the maritime law framework that's about to reshape how a lot of people understand this case, all of it happened, or is about to happen, because that meeting took place first. There's a moment in every case like this where the story stops being about what happened on one afternoon and starts being about what the law says should have happened instead. For 11 days, this case has been about a boat, a beach, and a boy who stayed behind to keep talking to a girl. Today, it became about something else entirely: duty of care, boating under the influence, a phone that never should have left with anyone but him. 3 things became official this week, and once you understand what they actually mean, you'll understand why so many people are saying the same thing tonight. It's worse than we thought, not because something new and shocking got announced in a press conference. Almost the opposite. Because the quiet procedural language buried inside a DA meeting and a legal breakdown of maritime law adds up to something heavier than any single headline could carry on its own. Before we get into what those 3 things are, I want to say clearly, the way I always do, that everyone named in this video is either speaking on the record, in an official capacity, or is a private citizen who has not been accused of any crime by law enforcement. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. What follows is what has been reported, what has been said publicly, and where the law itself might apply to those facts. That last part matters more this time than it usually does, so hold on to it. It's Wednesday, July 15th, 2026. 11 days since 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells disappeared from Horn Island, Mississippi. If you're just catching up, here's the short version, and it's worth having straight before we go further, because everything that happened this week only makes sense once you understand how this started. Nolan went out to Horn Island on the 4th of July with a group of friends. His friends say that sometime that afternoon, he chose to stay behind to keep talking to a girl named Katie, planning to catch a ride back later. He never made it home. His body was found in the water off the island 2 days after he disappeared. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. Subscribers who've been with this channel since the Gabrielle Ayres series know exactly how these cases tend to move. Slowly, then all at once. This week was the all at once. Here's the recap in full, because it matters for understanding why today's developments hit as hard as they did. Nolan's friends say the group left Horn Island around 4:30 that afternoon, after their boat started taking on water, with Nolan choosing to stay behind. Hours later, around 11 that night, one of the young men who had been on the boat called the Coast Guard, who said at the time the situation didn't require their assistance yet. Nolan's mother reported him missing around midnight. A multi-agency search eventually found his body off the northwestern tip of the island 2 days later. Since then, this case has been defined by small contradictions that never quite got resolved. Katie's family said, through a Facebook post from her sister, that no one told Katie he was heading back toward the boat. Nolan's best friend, Javon Williams, told 2 separate outlets on the record that he'd never known Nolan to stay back while his friends left, directly contradicting the story the friend group gave publicly. Judge Ashley Cole, whose son was on that boat, posted her own account, defending her son and confirming the timeline without addressing the phone, the keys, or the video that had already gone viral by that point. None of those threads got resolved this week. What did get resolved is the shape of what comes next, and that shape has 3 parts. The first thing that became official this week happened in a room most people will never see the inside of. This morning, Nolan's parents, along with their legal team, sat down with Jackson County District Attorney Angela Mears McElrath. Attorney Ben Crump described it afterward as a respectful conversation. He also said plainly that the family didn't come away with any real new information about the investigation itself. Sit with that for a second. A family sitting across the table from the one person who will decide whether charges ever get filed, leaving without a single new fact. That tells you something about where this case still is, more than a week after the body was found. What they did get was clarity on process, and process, in a case like this, is not nothing. The DA's office confirmed that once the investigation is complete, the results will go to a grand jury. For anyone who doesn't follow this kind of thing closely, a grand jury doesn't decide guilt or innocence. Its job is narrower than that. It reviews the evidence prosecutors bring to it and decides only whether there's enough to formally charge someone with a crime. That process typically happens behind closed doors, without the target of the investigation present, and without the kind of public spectacle that surrounded almost every other part of this case so far. That's an important distinction, because it means this week's news isn't an accusation against any specific person. It's a description of the road this case will eventually travel down, once investigators believe they have a complete picture. It also means the most consequential part of this entire process may end up happening quietly, away from cameras, which is a strange contrast to how loudly everything else about this case has played out in public. If you're new here, drop a comment with the word file, and I'll know you made it this far. We're just getting started. I want to slow down on something most coverage of this case has rushed past this week, because it changes how you should read everything else in this video. A grand jury referral doesn't happen automatically just because someone died under strange circumstances. Prosecutors have to build a case first, gather statements, request records, wait on forensic results, before they ever walk into a room and ask a group of ordinary citizens to weigh in on whether formal charges are justified. The fact that District Attorney McElrath confirmed this week that this case is now on that track tells you her office believes there's enough here to eventually present something. Not necessarily against anyone specific, not necessarily today, but enough that the next real step in this process isn't a press conference. It's a closed room a group of jurors who will never appear on camera, and a decision that could take weeks or months to actually surface. That's part of why Ben Crump's comment about the family leaving without new facts stings the way it does. Families in cases like this often imagine that once a meeting like this happens, doors start opening, answers start flowing. What actually happens, more often than not, is quieter and slower. The process starts moving, but the information stays locked behind it until the process is ready to release it. For a mother who has already buried her son once in her mind since July 6th, and now has to do it again on Monday in front of cameras and a national audience, that kind of institutional patience must feel like its own separate kind of grief. Subscribers who followed the Riviera Beach case remember exactly this rhythm. Weeks of nothing, then a single administrative update that reshapes the entire timeline overnight. This is that moment for the Wells case. Not an answer. A structure that guarantees an answer is coming, eventually, one way or another. There's a specific reason District Attorney McElrath's office chose to hold this meeting in person rather than simply issuing a written statement, and it's worth thinking through. Meetings like this typically happen when a prosecutor's office wants to manage expectations directly, face to face, rather than letting a family read cold procedural language in a press release and draw their own conclusions from it. That suggests the DA's office understood exactly how fragile trust in this process has become and made a deliberate choice to sit across from this family personally rather than communicate through intermediaries. Whether that gesture ultimately means anything beyond good optics is something only time will answer. But it's a detail worth noting, because it tells you the DA's office is, at minimum, aware of how closely every move it makes in this case is being watched by this family and by an audience far larger than Jackson County alone.
Nolan Wells, we have present with us his mother and father, Christine and Elmore. We've just had an opportunity to meet with District Attorney Angel McElrath and some members of her team. We had a very respectful meeting. The thing I assume some of you may know, the thing to announce, she shared with the family that there will be a grand jury that she will turn this case over to once they have collected all the information and finished their investigation. We also agreed that we will have a mutual inspection of the cell phone with our experts and their experts. Attorney Eric Hertz is helping lead the investigation team with former law enforcement experts who are going to help us with the cell phone download. So everybody will be able to see at the same time what the cell phone has. We also talked about trying to make sure we dot every I and cross every T. I know that we're getting about 50 calls a day to 100 calls a day from people who were there on Horn Island, people who are familiar with individuals that were there on Horn Island. And so we continue to be steadfast in trying to get to the truth of why Nolan Wells is dead.
The second concrete outcome from this week's meeting involves the piece of evidence that's mattered more than any other single object in this entire case. The phone. Investigators and the family's legal team agreed to what Crump's team called a mutual inspection, meaning experts working for both sides will examine Nolan's cell phone together, rather than the family simply being told what investigators found on their own. Attorney Eric Hertz, now helping lead the investigation effort for the family, was named publicly for the first time this week as part of that process. If you've been following this case, you already know why that phone matters so much.
And
It
in the
came
next
back to
minute,
the
I'm
family
breaking down
with
in
no
tears
saved
because it's
Snapchat
a
content
constant
from
reminder.
that day.
Because if I'm being
Checked
honest,
before the
we
usual
really just have
24-hour
not had
window had
time to
even
fully
passed,
grieve with
and a
everything that's
location
going on.
history that
This
didn't
is your
match
baby,
where the
and
phone
everyone
itself
must
was later
understand
found.
that. And just
A
day
joint
by day,
inspection means both
have you been
sides will
hearing
be looking
anything
at the
from
same data at the
investigators?
same time, which at minimum
No,
should
the last
shrink
time
the
I
amount
spoke
of
with
this
an
case.
I mean, you mentioned a phone. Tashima, a huge question so many people have is why he would have left his cell phone behind. And you say you were the person who actually went and retrieved that phone for the family. How'd you get your hands on the phone? Where was it?
That is correct. Christine called me and told me, hey, where are the boys? Nolan hasn't been heard from since such and such time. Where are your boys? I said, well, Javon is with his girlfriend, and I just spoke with Jalen, and they are headed to downtown, which I was literally getting ready to get in the shower to go downtown as well. She said, well, Nolan hasn't been. So I instantly called with Christine on the phone, Javon. Javon said no, he hadn't seen Nolan since early on the island. And he was like, what? Are y'all serious? We was like, yes. And so Christine intervened in the conversation, said, Nolan has not have been heard from since he left the island. So Javon was like, well, that's when I seen him. I haven't seen it since then. Again, everybody goes their separate ways. So I then hang up from Javon because obviously there's nothing he can say to tell me anything. So then Jalen, I call him. Jalen did not answer the phone. Christine again is on the phone. Jalen did not answer the phone. LeBaron, I called, he didn't answer the phone. I called LeBaron, which is their other friend, LeBaron Broomfield. He answered. He said, Jalen is in the gas station. Hold on. So he said, hey, Jalen, Mom on the phone. So he was like, Jalen, like, what's up, Mom? What's going on? I was like, hey, have y'all heard from Nolan? They said, no, we have not heard from Nolan.
But where was the phone?
So I was like, well, okay. So that's when we started tracking the phone. Well, for Christine, it said one place, but for them on Snapchat, it showed another place. So that's the place we went to. And it showed that everybody that was in the house, it was like a lot of people there. Like I'm not familiar with all the kids. I only know like one or two people there. But it showed that the phone was at what a lot of people were at. So that's how we knew where to go to. We went there. They were all there. They were sitting there, lights off, watching TV.
Did they immediately give you the phone? Because knowing that phone was there.
It took about 15. They did. They gave me the phone, but it took about 15 minutes to get the phone. Because I even asked, I'm like, did y'all have to walk back to Horn Island to get the phone? Or like, where's the phone? Because it took so long when they said it was when Wyatt told me it was in his truck. It took him so long to get the phone back to me.
Christine,
so when they brought the phone back.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Tashima. I want to hear that.
When they brought the phone, after I said something about it, he was like, well, she's going to get it. I was like, who's going to get it? He's like, the girl's going to get the phone.
That depends on which side you happen to trust more. Neither side has to simply take the other's word for what that data shows. And that phone is exactly where the next part of this story starts, because what's being reported about how that phone ended up separated from Nolan in the first place is where the legal picture gets a lot more serious than a lot of people initially assumed. The FBI also put out its own statement this week, and the specific wording matters. From day one, the statement said, "We have been supporting Jackson County as they've worked to gather information and find answers for the Wells family and the community. The FBI will remain ready to assist Jackson County Sheriff's Office investigators as they request our support, particularly when federal resources may expand their capacity to provide clarity and peace of mind for Nolan's loved ones." That language is doing something specific. It is not the FBI announcing it has taken over this case. It's the FBI describing itself as a resource sitting alongside a local investigation, available when asked, rather than a federal agency running its own separate inquiry. Forensic help, digital recovery, jurisdictional coordination, without any full transfer of the case itself. It's a small piece of language, but it's the clearest official word yet on exactly how involved the federal government actually is here. More precise than a lot of what's been assumed about it online. It's also worth remembering that investigators are still sitting on an open request they made publicly more than a week ago, one that hasn't been withdrawn or updated this week. They've asked for any original, unedited photos or video taken on Horn Island on July 4th, particularly anything showing what they've called alleged altercations, or anything showing Nolan himself. That request is still active tonight. Nobody said publicly whether it's produced new evidence, which means we genuinely don't know whether investigators are sitting on footage the public hasn't seen, or whether that appeal has mostly gone unanswered. Given how many hours were logged that day, boats arriving throughout the morning, a beach reportedly packed with holiday crowds, and at least one physical altercation captured on camera and later misattributed online, it would be surprising if there wasn't more footage out there somewhere that simply hasn't reached investigators yet. Let's walk through the timeline itself one more time, slowly, because the gap inside it is exactly where a lot of these legal questions actually live.
Let's bring in Anna Schechter, who runs our crime unit. She's joining us right now. Anna, so what are we learning about those new details in this case? What can you tell us?
Well, we actually have obtained new movement records, GPS data. Our Jared Eggleston and Skylar Henry down in Mississippi obtained this from a Mississippi entity, and it actually shows exactly where the boat left from when it arrived at Horn Island. You're seeing, as that scrolls down on your screen there, you're seeing that July 4th, that tracking movement, the vessel reaching Horn Island around 11:14 a.m. And then we also see when the boat left. Now, as we've been reporting, Nolan Wells was not on that boat, although his keys and phone were. And so we see the boat then go and actually dock at a different location.
We're sinking. Can you all please come?
And is everybody on board in good health otherwise?
Yeah. Everybody's on board.
She got a point. Because of the obvious and blatant lies that have already been told to us. But whenever something new comes out in this case, it's always something sketchy. It always creates more questions than answers. Now, them saying everybody is on board is not an admission that Nolan Wells was on board. They could have very well just been talking about whoever was on board. True. But still in all, again, it's just a pattern. Whenever something new comes out, is always something sketchy. Now, the next part, the GPS data, that is the one that created more questions than answers. Like, that's the one that a lot of people is hyper-focused on right now, because the GPS data shows, so they left the island, they was on the northwest part of the island, they was trying to leave, their boat started to sink. Now, apparently they was offshore enough to where they couldn't just swim back, so they had to call for help. Now, the part of the island that they was sinking and needed help from is apparently the exact same side of the island where Nolan Wells' body was found.
Now, as we've been following this story, and what we have now noticed is that the call looks to be made in the same area Nolan's body was found 2 days later on Monday. The body was discovered by a U.S. Park Service ranger. Now, this clearly now gives us a better understanding that when the friends allegedly last seen Nolan at 3 p.m., they would make a call about the boat taking in water and needing of a tow. Now, at 4:31 p.m., they would eventually be towed for about 2.7 miles out before returning to normal operation and headed back to land. Now, after gathering all this information, it now seems for some that Nolan's incident, given that his body was found in the same area, had to have happened between the call at 3 p.m., when they stated to last seeing him, and when they would be towed away at 4:31 p.m.
With all the evidence now coming out, and there's talks of a grand jury, people are getting excited that Nolan Wells is about to get justice. That Nolan Wells is finally about to get justice, and people are going to be held responsible.
The boat reportedly left Horn Island around 4:30 in the afternoon. The call to the Coast Guard didn't happen until roughly 11 that night. 6.5 hours later, Nolan's mother reported him missing around midnight, close to 7 hours after the boat had already reached shore without him. That gap, 4:30 to 11, is the single largest unexplained stretch of time in this entire case. What happened during those 6.5 hours? Who knew Nolan hadn't made it back during that window? Whether anyone tried to reach him, and whether they could have, given that his phone reportedly never left the island with him in the first place. Investigators have not publicly detailed what, if anything, occurred during that gap, and it's one of the central questions a joint phone inspection could potentially help answer, if the location data and message timestamps from that window turn out to be recoverable at all. 2 things confirmed: a grand jury on the horizon, a joint phone review underway. If this story ended there, it would already be the biggest procedural update this case has had in days. It doesn't end there. Because separately from anything the DA's office said this week, a different kind of picture has started coming into focus, and it's one that changes how a lot of people are reading everything that's happened since July 4th. If you're still with me, drop the word phone in the comments. I want to know how many of you caught that detail about the Snapchat window the first time this story broke. Let's actually sit inside what a joint phone inspection looks like in practice, because the phrase gets thrown around a lot in coverage like this without anyone explaining what it actually means. In most cases, when law enforcement seizes a device, they run it through their own forensic extraction, using tools that pull deleted messages, location pings, app activity, sometimes even data the phone's owner never knew was being logged in the background. The family, historically, only sees what investigators choose to share afterward, in whatever form they choose to share it. A mutual inspection flips part of that arrangement. It means an expert, working on behalf of the family, sits in the same room, watching the same extraction happen in real time, able to ask questions about what's showing up and what isn't. It doesn't mean the family gets to keep the phone, and it doesn't mean they control what happens with the data afterward. But it does mean nobody can quietly decide what does or doesn't get flagged as significant without another set of trained eyes watching it happen. That matters enormously here, because of what's already publicly known about this specific device. No saved Snapchat content from July 4th, despite the app's ephemeral messages typically only disappearing after a set window, one that investigators would have needed to move fast to preserve if they wanted to capture anything before it expired. A location history that reportedly doesn't match up cleanly with where the phone itself was later recovered. Those aren't small technical footnotes. Those are the kinds of details that, depending on how they're eventually explained, either close a chapter of this case or blow it wide back open. And then there's the federal statement, which deserves one more pass because a single sentence in it is doing more work than most people gave it credit for this week, particularly when federal resources may expand their capacity to provide clarity. Read that again slowly. It's not a commitment, it's a conditional. It says the FBI is prepared to step in further, if asked, if the local investigation determines it needs help it currently doesn't have. That's a very different posture than a federal takeover, and it's also a very different posture than total federal absence. It's an agency standing at the edge of the room, watching, ready, waiting to be waved forward. Whether that wave ever comes may end up telling us just as much about this case as anything the grand jury eventually sees. Federal involvement in a case like this typically escalates for one of a few specific reasons. If local resources genuinely lack the forensic capability to process something, like advanced digital extraction on a damaged device, if there's a credible indication a federal law was potentially violated alongside any state-level charges under consideration, or if local and state authorities themselves request additional support because the case has grown large enough that they want another set of trained eyes on it. Nothing in the FBI's statement this week confirms any of those specific triggers have occurred, What it confirms is that the door is open and that Jackson County knows exactly how to walk through it if they decide they need to. Here's the third thing, and it's the one that's landed hardest with people watching this case closely this week, because it isn't about what investigators said, it's about what the law already says, regardless of what anyone says next. I want to be careful with this section, because it involves a body of law most people have never had a reason to think about, and because nobody in this specific chain of events has been charged with anything. What follows is legal analysis of publicly reported facts, not an accusation. Maritime law is a specific body of law that governs what happens on the water, separate from the laws that apply on land. And it exists because boats carry a kind of responsibility that cars and houses don't. One of the central concepts in maritime law is something called duty of care. In general terms, it's a legal obligation that requires boat owners, operators, and anyone effectively in charge of a vessel to protect the people on board from harm, by keeping the boat itself seaworthy and by making reasonable decisions about the safety of everyone who came out on it. Here's where it gets specific to this case. Under that framework, a passenger is generally considered to be anyone who left the dock with you on a boat you were operating. And in general, the operator is considered responsible for the safety of every one of those passengers for the duration of the trip. Legal commentators looking at this case have raised the question of whether that responsibility extended to Nolan even after he chose to stay behind on the island, since he had left the dock as part of that same group. Whether or not that argument holds in this specific case is something a court would ultimately decide, not something settled by a YouTube video. But it's the reason this detail about the boat matters so much more than it seemed to 2 weeks ago. And there's a second detail sitting right next to it that a lot of commentators say makes the picture worse. Nolan's phone was reportedly on the boat when it left, not with him. If that detail holds up, it means whoever was responsible for that boat left the island having taken the one thing that could have let Nolan call for help, communicate his location, or reach anyone at all once he realized he was on his own. Legal analysts have pointed out that if it's established a boat operator knowingly left a passenger behind without a working phone or any way to communicate for safety, and that decision is found to have been negligent, that's the kind of fact pattern that can, in some cases involving a loss of life, support a charge like involuntary manslaughter. To be direct about where this stands, nobody has been charged with involuntary manslaughter or with anything else in connection with Nolan's death. This is what legal commentary around this case has focused on, not an outcome and not an accusation against any specific named individual. But it's exactly why so many people this week are saying this case looks different now than it did a week ago. Then there's the question of alcohol, and this is where an interview that's been sitting in the background of this story for weeks suddenly matters a lot more. One of Nolan's friends, Trace Shepard, believed to be around the same age as Nolan, told ABC News on the record that he and the group of friends, which included Nolan, had been drinking since late morning that day. Mississippi's legal drinking age is 21. If it's ultimately established that the person operating the boat had also been drinking, legal commentators note that could support a separate charge, boating under the influence, sometimes referred to as BUI. And if the toxicology results, still pending from both the state examiner and the independent examiner in Washington, D.C., eventually show Nolan himself was intoxicated at the time of his death, several legal analysts following this case say that finding wouldn't reduce anyone's potential liability. If anything, it could multiply it, since a boat operator's duty of care is generally judged even more strictly when the people on board are impaired and less able to protect themselves. There's a reason legal commentators keep returning to the alcohol question specifically, rather than treating it as a side detail. Boating under the influence statutes in most states including Mississippi, generally set a blood alcohol threshold similar to driving under the influence on land, and courts have historically been willing to treat impairment on the water as seriously as impairment behind the wheel, precisely because the consequences of a bad decision on open water can escalate so much faster than they would on a quiet residential street. If it's ultimately established that alcohol was a factor in any decision made that afternoon, whether that's the decision to leave when the boat did, the decision about who stayed and who left, or the decision about who kept possession of which phone, legal analysts say that detail doesn't exist in isolation. It compounds with everything else: a boat that was reportedly taking on water, a passenger count that reportedly reached 7, a vessel whose registered capacity, depending on its exact configuration, may or may not have supported that number safely. Each of those facts on its own might be explainable. Stacked together, they're the kind of pattern that maritime law was specifically built to scrutinize. None of this is confirmed against any specific person. No one has been named as a suspect. No one has been charged. What's confirmed is the framework, the questions investigators and prosecutors will eventually have to answer once the grand jury actually convenes. And once you understand that framework, the sheriff's early comment about no foul play being suspected starts to look very different in hindsight. Drop the word wave if you're watching this at night, the way I imagine most of you are. This next part is where things get uncomfortable. I want to widen this out for a moment, because maritime law isn't some obscure legal footnote invented for this case. It's an entire body of law with its own courts, its own precedent, its own long history, built specifically around the idea that the water strips away a lot of the protections people take for granted on land. There's no ambulance idling nearby, no street light to walk toward, no neighbor's porch light to knock on. Everyone on that water that afternoon was, in a very real sense, entirely dependent on the decisions made by whoever was steering the boat. That's precisely why duty of care exists as a legal standard in the first place, and why courts have historically held boat operators to a high bar when someone under their care ends up hurt or killed. Legal commentators following this case have pointed to a few specific facts that keep surfacing whenever this framework gets applied to what's publicly known so far. The timing of the departure, the condition of the boat, reportedly taking on water before it ever left, the decision, whoever made it, to leave without every passenger who arrived together, and underneath all of it, the reported presence of alcohol among a group of teenagers not legally old enough to be drinking it. None of these facts, standing alone, tells you what a grand jury will eventually see or what a prosecutor will eventually charge. But taken together, legal analysts say they form exactly the kind of fact pattern that maritime law was built to examine closely. Not a moral judgment, a legal one, methodical, slow, and entirely dependent on evidence that in this case is still being gathered. It's worth being honest about something here too. The word negligence gets thrown around casually online in cases like this, often to describe simple bad luck or a series of unfortunate decisions nobody could have predicted would end in tragedy. Legal negligence is a much higher bar than that. It generally requires showing that a reasonable person in that same position would have recognized the risk and acted differently. Whether that bar gets met here isn't something any of us watching from home can determine. It's something a prosecutor will eventually have to decide is worth putting in front of a grand jury, and something that grand jury will eventually have to weigh against whatever evidence gets presented to it, most of which the public still hasn't seen. It's worth adding one more layer here, because it's the layer that separates careful legal analysis from the kind of speculation that spreads fastest online. Duty of care cases involving recreational boating have a long, established history in American courts, stretching back decades before anyone on that boat was even born. Judges have repeatedly wrestled with exactly the kind of question this case raises. At what point does a group of friends simply making a series of unfortunate choices cross over into something a court would recognize as legally negligent? The answer has never been simple, and it's never been the same twice, because it depends entirely on the specific facts of each case. Facts that in this instance are still being gathered through a joint phone inspection that hasn't even concluded yet. That's precisely why legal commentary at this stage sounds careful and conditional, full of ifs and depending ons rather than definitive. Anyone offering you a confident, simple answer about how this case legally resolves this early, with this much still unknown, is offering you certainty the facts themselves don't yet support.
And this morning, dispatch audio from the boat Wells's friends took home in distress. A person heard requesting help.
We're sinking. Can you all please counsel?
And is everybody on board in good health otherwise?
Yeah, everybody's off the way.
Friends told us Wells stayed behind with a girl he had met.
There's one more detail sitting inside all of this that deserves its own moment, because it's easy to skip past it as a technicality when it's actually one of the more unsettling threads in the entire case. Reports indicate GPS and audio have now been released from that day, and according to an extended version of the call made to the Coast Guard that night, the boat operator reportedly stated there were about 7 people aboard. The vessel itself has reportedly been identified through its registration number as a Triton boat, a model that comes in a range of sizes depending on the year and configuration. Whether that specific boat was within its legal passenger capacity that day hasn't been publicly confirmed, but legal commentators have noted that if it's ultimately found the vessel was over capacity, that's a separate issue on top of everything else, one that speaks less to a single decision made in the moment and more to whether the entire outing was set up safely from the very start. Capacity ratings on recreational vessels exist for a reason most people never think about until something goes wrong. They're calculated based on weight distribution, stability in rough water, and how quickly a boat can respond if conditions change suddenly, not simply on how many seats happen to be available. A boat that's technically capable of holding 7 bodies isn't necessarily built to do so safely, especially if that same boat was already reportedly taking on water before it left the island. If investigators are looking closely at capacity as part of this case, it's likely not because 7 people is an inherently reckless number, but because it adds one more variable to a boat that may have already been compromised before the group ever set out that afternoon. And then there's the phone itself, again, because it keeps circling back to the center of this story, no matter which direction you approach it from. Nolan's family has said they had to track the phone down themselves to get it back, which raises an uncomfortable question sitting underneath the joint inspection agreement announced this week. If it's ultimately established that the phone was taken off the island deliberately, without Nolan's knowledge or consent, some legal commentators have pointed out that could be examined as a separate issue entirely, apart from anything related to the boat itself. Again, to be clear, this is not a confirmed finding. It is a question raised by what's publicly known so far. One more thread the joint phone inspection may or may not end up answering. But sit with the practical version of that scenario for a second, separate from any legal label attached to it. A teenager, alone on an island as the sun starts going down, without the one device that could let him call someone, check a map, or simply let his mother know he was safe. Whether that happened because of a simple oversight in the chaos of a boat taking on water, or because of a decision someone made deliberately, changes the legal analysis significantly. It does not change what it must have felt like to be Nolan in that moment, watching the boat pull away with the only thing connecting him to the rest of the world still on board. That image, more than any statute or legal term, is probably the single detail that's made this case impossible for so many people to look away from. Not the maritime law, not the grand jury, just a kid on a beach, watching his ride disappear, with no way to tell anyone where he was. That's part of why the family reportedly went to the trouble of tracking the phone down themselves rather than simply waiting for it to be returned voluntarily. If you've ever had to use a phone-finding app to locate a device that should have simply been handed back to you, you already understand the particular kind of dread that comes with watching a blinking dot on a map instead of getting a phone call. For a family already searching for their son, having to also search for his phone, separately, adds a layer of confusion to an already unbearable few days that shouldn't have needed to exist at all. Against that backdrop, one comment this week landed especially hard. Wednesday night, the governor of Mississippi gave his first public reaction to the case, and it did not sit well with a lot of people watching. "I don't know all of the facts surrounding the case," he said. "I have yet to see a fact or a piece of evidence that suggests any foul play, but if there is, I feel confident that the sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, the members at the Department of Public Safety that deal with these crimes, should there have been one, they will find it and they will do what is necessary." In that same statement, the governor confirmed that he and Sheriff Ledbetter, who is leading the investigation, are personally close. For a case that's already built almost entirely on questions about whether the people closest to power are getting the benefit of the doubt that an ordinary family never would, that detail didn't land as reassurance. For a lot of people watching, it landed as exactly the opposite. A reminder of why the phrase "justice for Nolan" has become less of a hashtag and more of a direct question aimed at a system a lot of families feel has never asked this hard about them. It's worth remembering why this case has held the country's attention the way it has for 11 straight days. Nolan was the only black man in that group of friends photographed on the boat that day. In a town that's nearly 80% white, the same Ocean Springs where Nolan's homegoing service will be held Monday. Some people look at those photos and see nothing more than a group of teenagers on a boat. Others see the shape of Mississippi's own history sitting quietly underneath every unanswered question. I don't think either reaction by itself tells you what happened to Nolan Wells. But it's exactly why one early comment about no foul play being suspected did as much damage as it did, and why a legal framework involving maritime law and duty of care is landing this week the way a major break in the case would in almost any other story. If you've made it this far, drop the word truth. I want to see how many of you are still here for the part of this story that actually matters most. I keep returning to that phrase, personally close, because of how much weight it's carrying in a case already this fragile. This isn't a case where trust between institutions and the public started at a healthy baseline and eroded slowly over 11 days. It started fractured, the moment an early comment from the sheriff's office suggested no foul play was suspected, before a body had even been recovered, before a single forensic report existed to support that conclusion one way or the other. Every development since then has been read through that fracture. The Coast Guard's initial response that the situation didn't require assistance yet. The judge's public defense of her own son without addressing the physical evidence directly. Now a governor confirming a personal relationship with the same sheriff leading the investigation. In the same breath, he expressed uncertainty about whether any wrongdoing occurred at all. None of that proves anything improper happened in this specific investigation. People in positions of authority in small and mid-sized communities are frequently connected to each other professionally and personally, simply because these are the kinds of places where the same handful of people tend to occupy public office over long periods of time. But in a case already defined by a black teenager's death in a town that's overwhelmingly white, where every early signal from officials leaned toward closing the book quickly rather than opening it further, that kind of familiarity doesn't read as neutral anymore. It reads, to a lot of people watching, as one more reason the family felt they needed independent legal counsel. an independently funded autopsy, and now a nationally known civil rights attorney standing beside them, instead of simply trusting the process to work the way it's supposed to on its own.
Does not reach it, so.
There's been obvious national attention on Mississippi because of the death of Nolan Wells, the football player found on Horn Island after July 4th, and all the racial overtones that come with that. Have you been in touch with investigators in Jackson County and asking for full transparency in that investigation so that the public will know exactly what happened to this young man?
The Sean Tyndall, the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, has been in contact with those individuals. Obviously, the autopsy was done by the State Medical Examiner's Office at the Department of Public Safety. I personally know Sheriff John Ledbetter from Jackson County very well. I have not personally spoken to him. I have full confidence that he is going to do his job. And what I will simply say is I don't know all of the details. I don't know all of the facts surrounding the case. I have yet to see a fact or a piece of evidence that suggests any foul play. But if there is, I feel confident that the Sheriff's Office, the District Attorney's Office, the members at the Department of Public Safety that deal with these crimes, if there had been one, they will find it and they will do what is necessary.
Because underneath every legal term, every maritime statute, every framework for what might eventually be charged, there's a family standing in an odd in-between place tonight, one that has nothing to do with courtrooms at all. A grand jury is now confirmed to be waiting at the end of whatever the investigation turns up. A named attorney is sitting down with investigators to go through Nolan's phone together. The FBI has put its actual role in writing, in its own words, rather than leaving it to speculation. And none of that changes the fact that this family still has to bury their son before they can go back to demanding the answers they've been asking for since the 4th of July. Nolan's body was sent to Washington, D.C. for an independent examination, funded in part by former NFL player Colin Kaepernick. As of this week, those results still haven't been released. Crump said he expects preliminary findings very soon, likely after the family's funeral services are finished. That timing reflects a deliberate choice by the family to bury their son first, before turning back to the analytical, evidentiary side of this case. That's not a small thing to choose. Grief doesn't pause itself to accommodate an investigation schedule, and no family should have to pretend it does. Christine Wansley announced that Nolan's homegoing celebration will be held Monday, July 20th, at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with visitation from 9 to 11 that morning, followed by the service. Reverend Al Sharpton, who's already stood beside this family publicly more than once, has agreed to officiate. Afterward, instead of a traditional repass, the family is holding what they're calling a celebration of Nolan's life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, and they've specifically invited his former teammates from both his high school and middle school playing days to join family and close friends. Tyler Perry is covering the funeral costs, something he offered weeks ago and is now being put to use. Think about what it actually takes to plan an event like that under these specific circumstances. Coordinating with a church large enough to hold what's likely to be a significant crowd, given how much national attention this case has drawn. Working with a fairground venue afterward, capable of hosting former teammates from 2 separate schools alongside family and close friends, all while a legal team is simultaneously coordinating a joint phone inspection and preparing for whatever the grand jury process eventually requires. Most families planning a funeral get to do so with some measure of privacy, deciding quietly among themselves what feels right without an audience watching every choice. This family has had to make every single one of those decisions, knowing cameras will likely be present, knowing commentary channels like this one will be discussing the choice of venue and officiant within hours, knowing that grief, for them, no longer gets to be a private thing, even on the one day that should belong entirely to them and to Nolan. There's something worth sitting with in how deliberately this family has planned that day. A homegoing celebration instead of a funeral in name. A fairground gathering instead of a quiet repass in someone's living room. Football teammates from two different chapters of Nolan's life, specifically invited alongside family. None of that is required by any legal process. None of it moves the grand jury forward by a single fact. It's a family choosing, in the middle of the most public, most scrutinized tragedy imaginable, to make sure the day they bury their son looks like the life he lived before any of this happened to him. I keep coming back to that detail about the teammates, honestly, more than almost anything else in this update. Grand juries and maritime law and cell phone inspections are the parts of this story that get clicks and headlines. A row of young men in football jerseys from two different schools, standing together at a fairground because a family specifically wanted them there, is the part that tells you who Nolan Wells was to the people who knew him longest, long before any of this happened to him. It's easy, watching a case like this unfold in daily headlines, to start thinking of Nolan only as a set of contested facts. A timeline, a phone, a pair of shorts, a legal theory about duty of care. That funeral plan is a pointed reminder that he was first and always somebody's teammate, somebody's son, somebody's friend, long before he became the subject of a national conversation about race and accountability in this country. Subscribers who followed the Cheryl Canty case know exactly this feeling. The moment where the legal detail and the human detail sit side by side, and only one of them actually explains why you're still watching. Comment the word home if this part hit you the way it hit me putting it together. There's a version of grief that plays out entirely in private, and there's a version that has to happen with the entire country watching, and Christine Wansley has been living inside the second version since the moment her son's name first went viral. Every choice she's made publicly since then, the independent autopsy, the attorney, the decision to speak directly to reporters about her discomfort with the word accidental, has had to be made in real time, in front of an audience, while still somehow finding room to plan a funeral that feels like her son instead of like a case file. I don't think most people fully appreciate how much strength that takes until they imagine having to do it themselves. Planning a homegoing while a governor is on television questioning whether there's even anything to investigate. Choosing hymns and a venue and a guest list for former teammates, while a legal team somewhere is preparing questions for a joint phone inspection. Those two realities, the mother and the case, are not supposed to exist in the same week. And yet here we are, 11 days in, watching a family carry both at once. Subscribers who watch the Marlon Sanders coverage know this feeling too. The way a family's private mourning gets folded into a public timeline, whether they're ready for that or not. What I keep coming back to, with the Wells family specifically, is how much agency they've managed to hold on to inside a process that so often strips it away. They didn't wait for the state's autopsy alone. They didn't accept the sheriff's early framing. They didn't let this become a story told entirely by other people. And now, even in planning how they say goodbye, they've centered it around who Nolan actually was, a teammate, a friend, a son, rather than letting it become just one more headline about a case that's still unresolved.
Hello everyone. So the homegoing celebration, the funeral will be held at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs. It is going to be visitation will be 9 to 11, and then the funeral will start after that. The plan is for the repast because, again, we want to celebrate Nolan. And he would not want us to be sitting around crying and eating. And so what we're going to do is kind of have a party to celebrate him, and that'll be held at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. So we really do want to keep it for family and friends. We are going to allow media to come in as well. And lastly, his teammates. Oh, absolutely, teammates. We've already contacted Coach Les George, because we want to make sure that those guys are there. Former teammates from high school, middle school, teams that he played against. You guys are all welcome, but of course, we want to make sure that our families for sure and close friends get there. So I do want to just say, for those of you, again, if you are having protests, even the day of his service, I am asking you guys to just keep it peaceful. Nolan would never want any type of violence or anything like that. He was not that kind of person. So if you guys would, again, just be peaceful. And to the community, thank you so much. Just the outpouring of love, support. We've had some local officials. Mayor Casey Vaughn from Gaucher has reached out to us. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you. He has, it's almost been every day. He's been texting to check on us. Also, Jeffrey Hullum, thank you so much. He's been texting pretty much every day. Receiving a lot of stories from Nolan's teachers, which just warms my heart, his classmates, teammates. So again, for those of you who have donated to the GoFundMe, once again, I stress, if you are not financially able to, we're not begging for that money, okay? If you're not financially able to, we understand. We thank you for whatever you can give, but if you cannot, if you would, just keep us in your prayers. And to his friends, stay strong, and please just take care of your mental health, because I know this is a lot. It's a lot for us, and I know you guys are feeling some of that too. So thank you all.
Before we close this out, I want to zoom all the way back out, because it's easy after 45 minutes of grand juries and maritime statutes to lose the thread of why this specific case, out of the dozens of similar tragedies that never make it past local news, became a national story in 11 days. Ocean Springs sits on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a town most people outside the state had never heard of before July 4th. It's the kind of place that shows up in tourism brochures for its beaches and its small-town charm. And it's also the kind of place with a specific, well-documented history when it comes to how differently justice has moved depending on who's asking for it. That history doesn't convict anyone in this case. It doesn't prove intent or negligence or wrongdoing by any specific person on that boat. What it does is explain why so many people who have never set foot in Mississippi and have no personal connection to this family still refuse to look away from it. Cases like this tend to follow a familiar pattern once they reach this stage, and it's worth naming because you'll likely recognize it happening in real time over the coming weeks. First, the institutional response softens under pressure, replacing early certainty with careful, hedged language about ongoing investigations. Then comes a period where official channels go quiet, sometimes for good procedural reasons, sometimes because there's genuinely nothing new to report, and the public is left to fill that silence with speculation, some of it accurate, plenty of it not. Then, eventually, a resolution arrives, a grand jury decision, an autopsy release, a set of charges or a formal declination to charge, and that resolution either restores some faith in the process or confirms every fear people had about it from the very beginning. We are, right now, squarely inside that middle phase, the quiet one, the one where nothing dramatic happens for days at a time, and then suddenly, a DA meeting and a maritime law breakdown arrive within 72 hours of each other, and reframe the entire case overnight. It's also worth saying plainly that most families who lose a child to a preventable tragedy on the water never get an independent autopsy funded by a professional athlete, a civil rights attorney with a national platform, or a governor forced to answer questions about the case at a podium. Most of those families get a local obituary, a GoFundMe that barely covers the funeral costs, and silence from everyone else. The fact that this case has generated enough attention to force answers, however incomplete those answers still are, says something uncomfortable about which tragedies get treated as newsworthy and which ones simply disappear. That's not a criticism of this family for accepting help they clearly needed and deserved. It's a question for the rest of us about why help like this is the exception instead of the rule. There's a comparison worth making here, carefully, because it's the comparison a lot of people watching this case have already started making on their own. Cases involving young people and water, boating accidents, drownings during group outings, are not rare in this country. Most of them never generate a grand jury referral, an independent autopsy funded by a public figure, or national coverage of this scale. What tends to separate the cases that get this level of scrutiny from the ones that quietly close within a matter of weeks isn't usually the facts themselves. It's whether the people affected have the resources, the platform, and the persistence to keep pushing after the first official explanation gets offered. Christine Wansley's early discomfort with the word accidental, stated publicly and repeatedly, is arguably the single reason this case didn't end the way so many similar ones do, with a brief local news segment and no further follow-up. That's not a criticism of how this case has unfolded. It's an honest observation about how much weight falls on grieving families to essentially litigate their own child's death in public, simply to get the same level of scrutiny that should be applied by default. I think that's also why the maritime law details landed as hard as they did this week, even though, again, nobody has been charged with anything. For 11 days, the public conversation around this case was largely emotional and circumstantial. A timeline that didn't add up. A phone that came back wiped. A judge's son involved without full transparency. What the maritime law framework did was give all of that circumstantial unease an actual legal shape, a set of specific standards, duty of care, negligence, BUI, that a prosecutor could, in theory, actually build a case around. It took a story that felt unresolved because nobody could quite say what crime, if any, might apply, and gave it a concrete legal vocabulary. That shift, from a feeling that something was wrong to a framework for what specifically might be provable, is very often the difference between a case that fades from public attention and one that ends up in front of a grand jury months later. So here's where this leaves us tonight, 11 days in, with 3 things now officially on the record. A grand jury confirmed to be waiting at the end of this investigation. A joint inspection of Nolan's phone now underway, with both sides looking at the same data at the same time. And a maritime law framework, duty of care, boating under the influence, the question of an overcapacity vessel, that's turned what a lot of people assumed was a tragic accident into a case with real legal weight behind it, regardless of what any final charges do or don't end up looking like. None of this week's developments resolve a single one of the contradictions that have defined this case from the beginning. Katie's account and the friend group's account still don't match. Javon Williams's description of who Nolan was still doesn't line up with the story that he simply chose to stay behind on his own. The black shorts in the police report still don't match the blue shorts in the family's photos. Judge Cole's statement, posted after her son was placed on that boat by the friend group's own timeline, still hasn't addressed the phone, the keys, or the video directly. Let's actually walk through what still has to happen before any of this reaches a real conclusion, because it's easy to feel like a grand jury referral means the finish line is close. It isn't. The state's toxicology results have to come back first, and officials have already said that a loan can take days or weeks, since samples typically get sent to outside labs rather than processed in-house. The independent examination in Washington has to conclude separately, and Crump has said the family wants their son buried before those results become the focus again, a choice that pushes the analytical side of this case back by at least several more days after Monday's service. Only once both of those reports exist can prosecutors realistically finish building whatever they intend to present to a grand jury. And only once a grand jury actually convenes, reviews that evidence, and reaches a decision behind closed doors without a single camera present will the public get any indication of whether formal charges are coming at all. Every one of those steps could move quickly. Every one of them could just as easily stretch into the fall. Nobody watching this case from the outside, myself included, has any way of knowing which it will be. What this week did was give this case a structure. A grand jury waiting at the end of the investigation, a joint process for examining the phone, a legal framework that explains, for the first time in plain terms, exactly what a boat operator's responsibilities were that day, and exactly what could be at stake if those responsibilities weren't met. A structure isn't the same thing as a resolution, and I don't want to pretend that it is, just because it's the biggest update this case has had in days. Nobody outside a very small circle, not the family, not the public, knows yet what that grand jury is eventually going to see, or what either autopsy is going to say. Whatever this investigation eventually concludes, it owes that family and everyone watching alongside them an answer that holds up once someone finally has to say it under oath. Not just a version of events that sounds tidy enough to close the case. If you're in Mississippi, or planning to pay your respects Monday at Centerpoint Church or afterward at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, keep that family and everyone who loved Nolan in your thoughts. For the rest of us, the honest thing to do right now is wait for the grand jury process and the autopsy results to happen, instead of filling that wait with more noise. Every few days, something arrives. A statement, a meeting, a funeral date, a legal term most of us had never had a reason to look up before this month. And it's tempting to treat each one as though it's the piece that finally explains everything. Most of the time, it isn't. Most of the time, it's simply the next visible step in a process that's still moving at the pace a real investigation moves at, slower than anyone watching it wants, and mostly invisible until something like this week happens and pulls part of it into public view. I've sat with this case longer than almost any other one I've covered on this channel, and I think it's because it refuses to resolve into a single clean narrative, the way a lot of true crime stories eventually do once enough facts come out. This isn't simply a story about a boat operator who may or may not have acted negligently. It isn't simply a story about a small town's history catching up with it in real time. It isn't simply a grieving mother refusing to accept an easy answer, or a legal team building a methodical case, one document request at a time. It's all of those things happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other, each one changing how you have to read the others. The maritime law angle doesn't erase the racial context. The racial context doesn't erase the legitimate legal questions about duty of care. The family's grief doesn't pause for any of it, and it shouldn't have to. There's also a quieter thread running underneath all of this that I don't think gets talked about enough in coverage of cases like this one. Every person connected to that boat that day, not just whoever was operating it, but every friend who was there, every parent who's had to answer questions about their child's involvement, is also, in their own way, living inside this case now, whether they wanted to or not. Judge Cole's public statement defending her son reads very differently depending on whether you believe she was protecting an innocent teenager from an unfair pile-on or shielding someone from legitimate scrutiny using the platform her position affords her. Both readings are possible from where we're sitting right now, and I don't think it's honest to pretend this channel, or any channel covering this case, actually knows which one is true. What we do know is that a group of teenagers went out on a boat on a holiday afternoon, and only one of them never came home. Whatever legal conclusions eventually follow from that fact, every young person who was on that water that day is going to be carrying some version of this for the rest of their life, regardless of what a grand jury eventually decides. What I keep asking myself, and what I'd genuinely like to know from you, is which of these threads you think ends up mattering most once this is all finally resolved. Is this ultimately a story about a legal system deciding whether a specific set of decisions made on a boat rise to the level of a chargeable crime? Or is it a story about whether that same legal system is even capable of asking that question honestly, given who was on that boat and where it happened? I don't think those two questions have the same answer, and I don't think we'll know which one this case turns out to actually be about until a grand jury finally does its work. Let me know down in the comments what you make of the maritime law angle, whether you think duty of care applies here, the way legal commentators are suggesting, and whether you believe Katie's account or the friend group's. Vote in the comments, K for Katie, F for the friend group, and I'll read through as many as I can. Let me know too if you think the toxicology results, whichever direction they come back, will actually change how this case gets prosecuted, or whether you think the outcome here was effectively decided the moment the sheriff's office made that first comment about no foul play being suspected. This case has moved forward these past 11 days because people kept paying attention to it, kept sharing what investigators asked for, and kept refusing to accept the first simple explanation that got offered back on July 6th. That kind of sustained public attention doesn't replace an actual investigation, a grand jury, or a toxicology report, and it never should. But it clearly hasn't hurt this one either. Monday, while most of us are going about an ordinary morning, a mother in Ocean Springs will be standing in a church, watching her son's former teammates carry a weight no 18-year-old should ever have had to carry for one of their own. Whatever the grand jury eventually decides, whatever the toxicology results eventually say, whatever comes of a maritime law framework that didn't even feel relevant to most of us 2 weeks ago, none of it changes what Monday actually is. A mother saying goodbye to her son, in public, with the entire country watching, because the private version of that goodbye was never something this case allowed her to have. Hit subscribe if you want the real update the moment, either the state's autopsy, the independent one, or a grand jury decision actually drops, because we're not going anywhere until this family gets their answers, however long that ends up taking. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.